Welcome to an extraordinary evening. We are going to write Matilda back into history. And I want to begin with the land acknowledgement of the Matilda Joslyn Gage Foundation. We acknowledge that we at the Gage Center are on the land of the sovereign Onondaga Nation. This land holds the cultural DNA and the spirit of the first people of this place, the Haudenosaunee, or people of the Longhouse. They are still here, and they continue to carry on their ancient responsibility for their land. We stand in solidarity with the Onondaga Nation and support their continuing struggle for the recognition of this land as theirs. We're committed to the work to dismantle the doctrine of discovery, the papal bulls which gave religious sanction to the taking of the land by the European settler people. This commitment is in keeping with the mission of the Gage Foundation to follow Gage's instruction. Upon you has fallen the glorious task of bringing liberty to the earth and all the inhabitants thereof. Well, I am really excited tonight with what we have in store because we are being gifted with a collaboration that I think is unique. I think we tend to think that history lives in the academy. Well, it lives there, but it also lives outside of the academy. Matilda was an extraordinary historian, and she had almost no formal training. So tonight, what we have is a collaboration of two women who were inspired by Matilda to tell a piece of her story that has been written out of history. One an academic and one a brilliant and, and gifted researcher and scholar. I want to start with introducing Tracy. Tracy Winter Allen is a retired music educator and volunteer researcher for the Matilda Joslyn Gage Foundation. She grew up in central New York, but didn't learn about Gage until her mother, Joan Basil, met Sally and became a volunteer, met me and became a volunteer at the Gage Center. Tracy retired to Canandaigua in 2018 and discovered Gage's connection to that area in 2019, and her lifelong interest in our country's history sparked the work that resulted in this new chapter of the suffrage movement. So Tracy, welcome. Tell us, how did you begin this journey?
Thank you, Sally. I really appreciate that introduction, and thank you everybody who is joining us tonight. In 2019, Sally sent out an email looking for someone to do a little research project for the center, and I thought, oh great, I can do that at home. I can give to the center because I live about 90-minute drive away. And she sent me on the task of finding all the mentions of Matilda Joslyn Gage in the history of women's suffrage. While I was doing that, I came across the information in that book put there by Gage and Stanton and Anthony about Gage's participation in Anthony's trial here in Canandaigua. And I was excited. I didn't know that. Everything in our town talks about Anthony. Yeah. Nothing mentions Gage, or if it mentions Gage, it's, oh, she came and did a few speeches. Oh, she sat next to her in the courtroom. And so I went over to the courtroom and I looked around and I thought, wow, Matilda walked up these stairs that I'm walking up, and I went along. And then in 2021, one of these virtual events happened, a picnic with the Gage Foundation, and Sally asked another question. She asked the participants, what programs would you like to see in the future? And something reminded me that the trial's 150th anniversary was going to be in a couple of years. And so I mentioned it then, and then I contacted Sally later and said, can I dig around and see what I can find? And she said, sure. And a pandemic, and about 2 years later, we have this. Oh, my screen is gonna be there. So that's how I started down my rabbit hole.
You want to talk a little bit about the collaboration? That was so much fun back and forth as you were drafting different, versions of it, and it sort of grew. You began with a smaller, uh, maybe just an article, and it eventually grew into a book. How did that happen?
I I spent a lot of time looking at online newspapers and online. I went into the the county historical society, and I found local Canandaigua newspaper articles. Then I went online and looked at and discovered newspaper articles from all across the country talking about the trial. I found many that mentioned Matilda and the speaking tour that Matilda and Anthony went on before the trial. And I put together what I thought was the whole story, and then shared it with Sally, who said, "Oh, I think maybe there's more to this. What about?" And started asking me lots of what about questions. And the probably the biggest thing that I learned when Sally challenged me to go find more was how much the suffragists in general, and how much Anthony and Gage in particular had been working together before the trial. Matilda didn't just get on a train and drive over here to sit next to Anthony at the trial in June. They had been doing an awful lot together before then. Women all across the country had been voting. So much of what I looked at, and so once I exhausted the online newspaper stuff, then I started to go to libraries and look at texts and looked for other scholars' work about the trial. And all of that work, if it mentioned Matilda at all, was again a footnote. And by that time, I knew Matilda was more than a footnote to the story. I knew she was an integral part of it. And then one of the other really fun discoveries, when Sally said, "I think there's more to this," was two things. Most of Anthony's day books, diaries, have been digitized and are available on the Library of Congress website. And so I read through Anthony's diary, 1872, up to the date where she voted. And then the rest of the diary is not on the website. I reached out to the Anthony house and they didn't seem to know where it was. And then I read through all of the 1873 diary. And I also found letters that are now digitized and available at the University of Rochester. And those letters are not Anthony or Gage. Those are Isabella Beecher Hooker and her husband John Hooker's letters. And they're from people all throughout the Hookers' lives. But there were 3 or 4, maybe 5 letters between Anthony and Isabella Beecher Hooker about the trial and about this time period in their lives. And that was really fascinating and opened up some really interesting connections and made me realize, wait a minute, this wasn't never just Anthony, and it was certainly never just Anthony and Gage, but there are many, many, many women and men involved in even this little tiny story of the giant, long story of the fight for women's suffrage in the country. And
Listen,
once I started looking, I couldn't stop.
that's an extraordinary deep dive into primary documents. It was essentially all primary research. Let's talk a little bit about the context of this. So Susan B. Anthony voted, and what people learn in history books and in school is this amazing single event. Susan B. Anthony voted. What's the real deal here?
The real deal is Anthony and her 14 friends in Rochester voted, and Matilda tried to vote, and women in Albany voted, and women in New York City voted, and women in California voted. And just in the 1872 election, thousands of women have been trying to vote or voting or being turned away at the polls since the end of the Civil War, since when Black male suffrage was granted. The women were now watching more and more and more groups of people vote, and they were not. And they started to go to the polls. They started to try to register to vote. They started to sue local registrars who would not let them vote or would not take their ballot. And so Susan and many women voted successfully. We will never know if their ballots counted, of course, but many women actually deposited ballots in the 1872 election. And they were really focused on that because it wasn't just a local election, it was a congressional and presidential election.
Mhm.
And they really wanted to have a voice in who was going to be the next president. And so
So
it was, go ahead, Sally.
there was a whole campaign of nonviolent civil disobedience. And that really has not been, I wrote about that quite a few years ago, but that's not, a consistent story in the context for Anthony voting. She was one of many, like you said, of thousands. Engages work in that, in creating the logic behind it in her women's rights catechism, where she basically says, look, it's based on the consent of the government, and with the 14th Amendment and the later enabling legislation, the federal government has the responsibility to protect its citizens against the states that are denying them to vote. So basically, Gage says women who vote are not the lawbreakers. The lawbreaker is the federal government that is failing to protect us in our right. And so Anthony's vote fits right into that, Tom.
It does. And Anthony really wanted to be arrested. She wanted to take her case to the Supreme Court. She did not get that opportunity because her lawyer, being a gentleman, could not bear to see a woman in jail, and he posted her bond or her bail. But Anthony and Gage both realized pretty quickly that because they were going to put her on trial, because it was going to be a federal trial, that they had a platform. They had a not quite a Supreme Court level platform, but they had a platform. And the other thing that frequently gets left out that I learned, of course, we all learned Susan B. Anthony because we learn that little tiny piece of it. But the Canandaigua trial was not the original trial. She was originally scheduled to be tried in May in Monroe County, where she lived. And when she got her court date in January. She was told in January she was going to be tried in May. She came home, and starting in February, and in February and March and April, in between traveling to other state conventions and other events, she was going all around Monroe County, giving public talks, giving an address that Matilda was very instrumental in helping her put together. Some scholars believe Matilda wrote the address for her. I've looked at it and trying to prove that Matilda wrote it or didn't write it, but what's pretty clear is it's not so much a speech full of rhetoric as it is a laundry list of legal and logical reasons why women should vote. So Anthony, with Gage's help, creates this speech, takes it all around Monroe County, is very open about saying, I'm going to tell every juror I can get to listen to me why I should be legally allowed to vote, based on Matilda's scholarly work and Matilda's ideas of federal government protecting us from state rights. Matilda actually called it centralized versus, which is kind of interesting to read how it's been identified in the past. So she goes all around Monroe County, gets to Brockport, gets to court, and her case isn't called. Matilda comes over to be with her at the case in Brockport. Doesn't get called. Everybody goes home, and Susan B. Anthony gets told around the 22nd of May, oh, we moved your trial to Canandaigua to June. See you then. And immediately organizes a new tour. But she knows she literally doesn't have calendar days to go speak in every potential jury pool area of Ontario County. So she sends out word, she sends letters, she asks for help. And who comes to help? Who's the only one who comes to help? Matilda. And that's a big part of the story too.
And Matilda wrote her speech and probably Anthony's speech, as Mary Corey in her book says pretty definitively that she wrote the speech. You know, difficult to prove, but given the fact that Anthony, when I think she described it, when I put pen to paper, it's like I'm on stilts. She said she was not a writer. But again, you've corrected history in this because in your book, because what we get in the traditional narrative is Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote her speeches and Susan B. Anthony went out and delivered them. And what we know is that Gage also wrote Anthony's and wrote, you know, majority with Stanton of the documents of the National Women's Suffrage Association. So there's another thing that you've that you've changed in the historic narrative. What so Gage comes to Anthony's defense, writes her speech, probably writes her own speech. They divide up the area, the county, to educate the voters or the potential, I'm sorry, the potential jurors. And we're going to hear more about that from Melissa. And she sat by Anthony during the trial as well, didn't she?
Yes.
What,
She
you know,
not only did she sit next to her at the trial, she made her own written record of the proceedings. She wrote down what happened. I think the women were probably concerned that there might not be any other written record of the trial. And after the trial, Anthony paid the what is now the company that publishes the Rochester newspaper, the Democrat and Chronicle. She paid a publishing company to print all of the transcription that Matilda recorded for her. She also printed in a little bound book and her own speech and Matilda's speech. The U.S. district attorney that prosecuted her refused to give Anthony his notes and his whatever he prepared for the trial. So that's missing from Anthony's published book, but she has all her own lawyers' statements. But most of that work came from Matilda's diligence of being there with her as well.
now in the history of women's suffrage, the story, is that Matilda's work, do you think? The story of the vote?
It's very short. It's a very capsulated version of it. So I would imagine it might be, or there might have been more that at some point got edited out for space or time. It's hard to say because it's such a short segment.
Mhm.
In the history of women's suffrage, what Matilda did make sure she put in was response to backlash from, of all places, the Albany Law Review Journal. Someone in the Albany Law Review Journal wrote this whole article about why it was perfectly okay that Anthony was convicted and she had no right to trial by jury and she had no right to vote because she's a woman. And Matilda made sure that her response to him, which was published in the Syracuse Journal, was printed in its entirety. So that's another place to go and look and see how Matilda and how the women felt about how they'd been treated. And so
And
Matilda's voice is there.
and Matilda was really talking about how justice had not been done because the jury wasn't allowed to decide, weren't they? How did that work out?
After Anthony's lawyer, whose name was Selden, after Henry Selden got done with his argument, the judge turned to the clerk and told the clerk to record a verdict of guilty. Nobody said anything. He turned and said, write down that she's guilty. Selden immediately objected, asked for the jury to be polled, and the judge denied that and said, nope, she's guilty, we're done, see ya. And then of course, the judge said to Anthony, do you have anything to say for yourself? And of course, Anthony did and stood up, and that's well documented. And when you look for the story of what happened at the trial, you frequently get she voted, she got arrested, and then you get her response to him, she got found guilty. And it just sort of, and scholars and books in exploring Anthony, from Anthony's point of view, just leap right over both the Monroe County speech tour and the Ontario County speech tour. I don't understand why. It's so fundamental to our American way of living and our American government to seek redress and to be able to go to your lawmakers and say, here's my concern, here's my need, or here's what we need to do, or here's how to make it better. But that part, I guess, just wasn't as interesting as her being found guilty. And of course, because she was guilty and because it didn't change anything, that also, I think, makes it less interesting. I tried, when I was pulling all this together, I tried consciously to think about the fact that no one knew what the trial outcome was going to be. Least of all, Anthony and Gage, and how for 25 years, it'd been 25 years since the Seneca Falls Convention and since the suffragists had started to work and organize. And here was a real genuine opportunity that nobody else had been afforded. And so when I was trying to pull all this together, I kept trying to say to myself, pretend you don't know how it's going to work out. Look and dig and search and find. I also spent a lot of time searching for, in addition for proof of who wrote these two speeches. Before we run out of time, because I want to give Melissa time, Sally, I want to make sure that for people who don't know, Melissa's motto, I don't know what Melissa's motto is, maybe she'll share. Matilda's motto, the first recorded, written down version of it that I could find, and that Sally could find, and that the great collected wisdom of the Gage universe could find, is actually in the speech she gave in Ontario County. And that too was something that was just too irresistible for me to find out, okay, really, was this really where she first put these ideas of hers down in what we now know so well? And I never found it before. We asked, I've looked, I've searched, and it's not exactly the way it appears on her tombstone, but it's pretty darn close. And so that too was another amazing discovery of something that happened at this building here behind me that I literally drive by 2 or 3 times a week. So she's there, and I see her and I remember, and I think about her, and I think about the work those women did, and how important it was then, and how important it continues to be, and how everything they fought for, everything they advocated for, everything they educated their generations for is still so important today. We're still facing voter suppression. We're still facing people, unfortunately, white male people with power, trying to keep non-white male people from expressing themselves politically, socially. Roe v. Wade being struck down, Dobbs destroying that, the Equal Rights Amendment that is still out there waiting to be finally ratified. All of the things that are in both Anthony and Gage's speeches all speak to all of these issues that we are still talking about, and we'll probably always have to talk about, because once we stop talking about our rights and start standing up and saying these are our rights and we demand them, then as we learned all too well with women's reproductive rights. If we don't stand up for them, we're going to lose them. Sorry, that was my soapbox.
Oh, thank you so much, Tracy. And what an amazing gift to history, to Matilda on her birthday, to have this book come out, the 150th anniversary of the trial and conviction of Susan B. Anthony. Your book will be available for sale online next week on the Gage website, and it will be premiered tomorrow at the Gage Center at 4 o'clock. We invite anyone in the area to come to the birthday party and get your book signed. So thank you so much, Tracy.
Thank
And
you.
now
It's
I
been
want
a
to
joy.
introduce, oh, thank you. I want to introduce Melissa. Melissa previously received a doctorate in English and is graduating in May with a master's in library and information science from Syracuse University's School of Information Studies. Her focus is on archives and cultural heritage and information equity. She was introduced to Gage last summer when she did an internship at the foundation to help arrange, describe, and preserve the foundation's archival collections. Melissa, you've done wonderful work for us last summer, and now this gift to the Gage Foundation and to Matilda. Um, how did you get started on deciding to do a storyboard, a story map based on the research that Tracy had done?
Well, first, I'm really privileged to be here with Tracy and Sally. And I was first introduced to Gage just last summer when I did that internship, and I was just really amazed by what excellent woman she was, and what a great rhetorician she was. And what kind of inspired me to create this story map that I created and that I'll share with you in a second is that in my work at the iSchool, I work with one of my professors, Dr. Beth Potan, on a project called Rocket City Civil Rights, which is related to her family and other folks' role in the civil rights movement in Huntsville, Alabama. So something I think Gage would be very proud of. And our primary aim with Rocket City Civil Rights is to tell stories about that era using primary sources and to tell those stories online. So we've used a couple of digital storytelling tools from Night Lab to create timelines and story maps that people can engage with in a digital setting. And I'll actually put down in the chat if anyone in the audience wants to follow up later on some of the things that we have created for Rocket City Civil Rights. And so recently, Dr. Potan and I worked together on a project mapping library services for Black citizens in Huntsville and about the first Black librarian in Huntsville, Dulcina DeBerry. And we found that the story map tool was really perfect for uncovering hidden histories. So most of Black Huntsville has been torn down for urban renewal. So lots of the physical buildings and sites of cultural heritage are no longer there. But with Story Map, we could kind of resurrect them, put them back on the map, retrace that geography. And Dr. Potan actually did a lot of legwork to find the exact locations that some of those sites for the Black libraries were. That people can now visit and sort of participate in their heritage again because of that. And we did a presentation on that project at the Library History Roundtable, and Sally has some connections at the iSchool who told her about it, and she knew me because I did that internship with her and asked if I could do something similar for the research that Tracy had done, which is also very spatial in terms of the story that's being told. And I thought that was a great way to visually and publicly put Matilda back into the story of Anthony's trial.
That's wonderful. It's, the sort of organic collaborations that emerge, really exciting. So do you want to share the story map with us?
Yeah, I will. And since there might be
This
some
is,
educators in the audience or others who might want to use this tool themselves, I'll show you the back door and the front door of this tool. So let me get
we
to a
all
place
should do, uh,
where
we almost should do a ta-da! This is the inauguration. This is the grand opening of the story map, seen for the first time.
all right. So this is the back door of StoryMap. So StoryMap is a digital storytelling tool that's created by Night Lab, which is out of Northwestern University. And it's very easy to use. That's kind of why I recommend it to educators. I think they could easily use it and also ask their students to use it for projects. So all you really need is a narrative, some locations. This should be a story that's easy to tell, geographically or spatially rather than necessarily chronologically. So some good visuals, a narrative, and some places. And what's great about this is that you can, in this center part here, you can enter a location like a town, but you can get it as accurate to like the street corner that you want to, using geographical coordinates. So the map that I created is something that people could use on a road trip, on a Gage road trip or a women's rights road trip to visit some of the exact locations that Gage probably spoke. And we know those because of the great research that Tracy did. So this is the back door. You enter text. You can upload some media for more visual interest. It gives you a background, a map background that you can choose. And then, you can preview it to make sure that it's displayed properly. Always important before you publish things. But now I'll just walk you through the actual story map, and I'll put this link into the chat so that you can play around with it later as well. The map itself is zoom inable and outable, so you can get as zoomed in as you want on the map on any of the screens, and then it just takes you around to the different locations. Oh, it doesn't look like it's displaying properly for me right now, actually. There we go. That Gage was in, and you sort of follow her throughout her journey. And one of the things that I wanted to accomplish here was, to not only show you where Gage was, but to give you a flavor of what it was like to be there listening to her on the stump, as the newspapers sometimes put it. So I put in excerpts from her speech so that you could get a flavor of the speech that she gave. I noted people who collaborated with her. Tracy took pictures of not only maps, but also actual physical locations that Gage probably spoke in. And I really wanted to highlight that research that Tracy had done. And there was one limitation to the story map format that ended up kind of being a feature rather than a bug, which is that originally we thought, oh, let's put it so that you can see where Anthony is going and where Gage is going at the same time. But this format is a little bit limited. We could only do just Gage's path on the map, which actually ended up centering Gage in the story in a way that we wanted to have happen anyway. But I do mention in the little historical notes, where Anthony was that day and what she might have been experiencing. And I tried to give a sense of what the women might have been up against, like there was terrible rain. the audience was not very receptive, but also the help that they had and the people who were there with them, helping them do it. And, you know, they make some really powerful arguments, and I wanted to put that language in as well. Oh, and Sally, also, I just want to mention that this story map is completely shareable. So if any of you want to share this on your social media or your website, Tracy and I are already credited on the story map. So this is a tool that I want people to use, and I want you to share widely. It will be on the Matilda Joslyn Gage Foundation website as well, if you want to access it that way. But anybody can use this link to spread the good word.
Gift to the world. And also, I think a model, you know, I think that this opens up for a lot of us that thought about what other kind of story maps could we do. And you also mentioned timelines can be done in this way.
Yeah, Night Lab also has a timeline tool, and I'll put the link for that also in the chat. And that's more suited to kind of chronological storytelling, where there isn't as strong of a geographical aspect, but it's just as easy to learn and use, I think, as story map tool is. These are just really fantastic tools.
So what may come out of this is that there may be more projects that people have interest in that gauge more into history in even more ways. Amazing work, both of you. Anything else, Miss Melissa? Any ahas, any amazing things that you didn't realize?
Yeah, actually, some of the arguments that those women made were really on point. And one of them was no taxation without representation. When I saw that, I was like, wow, they're just genius, right? Because women were being taxed, and they really hammered on that this is an illegal, it's illegal for the government to take our money to hold this trial, you know, like using government money that they stole from us. We don't have any right to vote, and this is taxation without representation.
Yeah, that was one of their brilliant. And I think when they launched their tax protest campaign on the anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, was another piece of that civil disobedience campaign. These women were kick-ass women.
They were incredibly savvy. Yes, they were incredibly savvy.
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to share?
I just want to applaud Tracy. Sally mentioned before that, you know, trained historians are usually the ones who get to tell these stories, and Tracy just did a really bang up job diving into the primary sources and doing the legwork, and I just kudos to her.
Thank you.
Kudos. A gift to the world, yes. And from both of you, thank you. Let's see if there are questions. If you want to put a question in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question or make a comment, please feel free.
I'll jump in and just say, Melissa, it has been such a privilege to get to watch you grow as a student. And I think I can speak for any educator here to say there is nothing more gratifying than getting to work on something with your student and then watch them take it off into the world and do something else with it. And so I'm so glad to see, you know, the story maps that we worked on are really helping you tell other stories. And for so often, we have talked about what it means for voices to be included and for people to see them represented in their selves, represented in our archives and in our curriculum. And so just congratulations to everybody here for making sure that we understand these voices and that these moments of social organization happened through hard work, and they weren't just accidents as they are so often presented to us and not full and complete histories. So thanks to all of you for putting this together.
Well, thanks, Bev. Kate, you had a comment or a question?
Yes, I think this is just absolutely fantastic. I'm totally enamored of Matilda, and I do hope to get to visit up there this summer. I obtained a copy of Women, Church and State and have read it cover to cover, and it just blew my mind. Now that was written 10 years after all this was going on, I believe in 1882.
93, actually, Woman,
Oh, and
Church, and State was published
written
in
then.
93.
So almost 20 years later then.
Yeah.
But I was curious back in 1872, as well as in 1893, where was she obtaining all the information from? Was it the University of, I mean, at Syracuse? You know, she was so knowledgeable of civilizations, basically all of what was known about the world appears in her treatise. And so I was just wondering what university or where she found that, what library, if you know.
I'll take a stab at that, and then Tracy, if you have anything you'd like to add, or anybody else on the Zoom. When I did a modern readers edition of Woman, Church and State, which is currently out of print, but I wanted to do a bibliography because there wasn't one in her book when she published it. And I actually was a visiting professor at Syracuse University at the time, and I used the Syracuse University archives and the special collections, and I found almost all the books that she referenced. And I wondered if that might have been a possibility. In her correspondence, she also talks about on trips to New York City, visiting the libraries there. She she read volumes and volumes. New books would come out, and she'd read them, comment on them, did notes inside the covers of the books, and her notes clearly reflect that she's having a dialogue, a conversation with the book, with the writer. So yes, she every place and every way she could, she educated herself. She also subscribed to a number of journals and newspapers,
I
which
was
was
going to
not
ask
uncommon.
you, Sally, I was going to throw that in that because her husband ran the dry goods store, wasn't that the newspapers would come to the store? Is that how, in addition to
That's
subscriptions?
probably likely, yeah. Yes.
And I did find her writing in the time leading up to the 72 election and then the 73 vote trial. I found examples of her writing back to the Fayetteville Weekly Recorder, talking specifically about going to the Astor Library when she was in New York City. And and then there's the letters at the Harvard Library, Harvard Radcliffe Library. Sally, correct me on the proper name for that. Schlesinger. Anyway, she writes in letters home to her family about going. She was at the National Women's Suffrage Association convention in January of either 72 or 73. I don't remember exactly which one. And she wrote home that she was going to go to the Smithsonian while she was there in Washington for the convention. So she strikes me as like I am. If I'm in a new place, I'll go see what museum is there that might be fun to go visit. That was the sense I got in my time looking at these 4 or 5 years of hers.
And so she must have been traveling by a combination of train and horse and carriage, correct? So she's
The
going
train
all over.
service was the train service was great. There were a number of trains each day going from Syracuse into the city.
Mhm. Oh, okay.
I want to mention that as part of my internship, I actually created a online virtual library, and one of the things that I created was I put the bibliography that Sally did. I created it as a library and pulled all these books together. So I'll just put that link. Lots of links
Oh,
today.
thank you.
I'll put that link in the chat too, and you guys can explore that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for mentioning that, Melissa. That was an amazing gift to the Gage Foundation and really put us ahead in terms of being able to share the information that we have. Thank you for that. Other questions or comments? Yes, Jean. I
I
think,
wrote,
yeah.
I want to thank Tracy and Melissa for all this great information. I wanted to mention cross-fertilization, and I think Matilda was really good at that. And I sort of take that as a model, but I'm working here in Virginia with some civil rights programs and history of Black history in Virginia, in the Leesburg area, and I'll be sharing some of Melissa's information. And as we're talking here about Quakers' work in suffrage, I'm always telling that group, no, you need to come up to Central New York and see where the real action was. So anyway, I just wanted to tell you that I'll be sharing all this information, and I thank you for it.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I was very struck by how many people along this journey, and therefore many hundreds more that are even more lost to history than Matilda, and yet the Anthony name seems to be the only name we hear, or we hear Anthony and Stanton. And the more I read and the more I dug into this, and there are really interesting characters in the story that I put together that no one even around here knew anything about, I think. And no great social change happens with one or two people. Like, what was the phrase you just used?
Fertilization.
Cross-fertilization. Thank you. That's so true. It just strikes me right now. It's so true of what these women were going through between when the presidential election 72 and the trial in 73, and how they were all working towards, maybe this will finally be the moment that we get to vote. And then it wasn't, and then they picked themselves up and kept on going.
Thank you, Jean. Other comments, questions?
There. Okay.
I may not see, if you have one, please just jump in.
I think there's one in the chat, Sally, second from the
Oh, I'm
bottom.
sorry, I missed it.
A DC, Denise.
I'm not, oh. What's your hypothesis
There it is.
for why Gage was virtually lost to history? Oh.
Sally, I'll jump in for a minute and give you a chance to take a breath for that, because I know you're the expert. But in terms of the trial and here in Ontario County, I think, unfortunately, which is still the case, the loudest voice gets the most attention. And Anthony was very willing to go anywhere and everywhere and talk to anyone, whether they wanted to listen to her or not. And she became easily identifiable because of her willingness to literally stand up and speak loudly. And I think Gage's intellectual and studiousness and her writing, she was spoke and she was willing to speak, but she also did so much more. And I also get the sense that Matilda wasn't aiming for the spotlight. That's very much my personal idea. But there's also, Sally's the expert on why she got written out of history. So go, Sally.
Well, I think that's absolutely clear that she did the work. She wanted the work to get done, and she wasn't as concerned about getting credited. In my anthology, Women's Suffrage Movement, I lay out the beginning of, I think, what happened. Anthony wanted the vote. And it was at a time when Stanton and Gage were beginning to talk about, we need to go to the root of our oppression, and it's the church. It's the creation of women as subordinate and under the authority of men that gets translated as Gage writes in Woman, Church, and State into canon law, gets translated into common law, and women become dead in the law. As a result, the two shall become one, and the one is the man. Gage wanted to really take that issue on. Stanton was with her initially. Anthony wanted the vote. Anthony made an alliance, and I, should never accept any of this without really checking the sources. And I think Lisa Tetro's book, The Myth of Seneca Falls, and my Women's Suffrage Movement anthology lay out the documentation of this, that Anthony wanted to bring together everybody that wanted the vote. And it didn't matter why they wanted the vote, just if they wanted the vote. And that meant that she was willing to bring in and actually really welcoming in and very much a fan of Frances Willard, who was the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which had as one of their platforms to create a Christian nation, to put God in the Constitution, Jesus Christ is the head of the government, and basically Christian nationalism, create an Orthodox Christian nation, which of course would have meant that anybody that didn't hold allegiance to whatever interpretation of God and Jesus they had embedded in the government would not be able to vote or run for public office. And Gage said, this is the great danger of the hour. She tried to undo the merger that Anthony created. And that merger brought in the conservative movement, and it also brought in the WCTU. She was unable to undo that merger in 1890. She drops out of the movement, and the movement moves to a place of conservatism, Christian conservatism, and actually practices racism as policy. Give women the vote because white women outnumber Negroes and immigrants, men and women, and women's suffrage is a way to maintain white, native-born supremacy. And they use the term white supremacy. Gage said that when that merger happened, it meant the death of the women's movement. And Anthony, in throughout Gage's work, she is working equally with Stanton and Anthony in the National Women's Suffrage Association before the merger, but she consistently gets written out. I mean, at one convention, Anthony's talking about the history of women's suffrage, which Stanton and Gage did all the writing for. Anthony saw to the publication of it, did correspondence, all of that. And Anthony, with Gage on the platform, talks about all the work that she and Stanton have done. And Gage writes, it's like Hamlet with Hamlet written out. that, it's a consistent process that's in the process of, I've done some documentation of that. Lisa Tetro has, other historians have. And so she gets written out of history, unfortunately, as the movement becomes more conservative. It follows Anthony's process and engages in embarrassment. If you're practicing racism, you don't want a woman who says that never was justice more perfect, never was civilization higher than with the Haudenosaunee, Native Americans, indigenous nations. So anyway, I'm sorry, that's the long article. And Jane, I think Jane Albright has added to that too. So anyway, I think any other questions, or I think we're reaching our 8 o'clock point, but if anybody has an additional comment or question,
Well,
jump in.
I would just add that what you just said was 100% what I was thinking, especially after reading Women, Church and State, and also participating down here in New Haven in a very old Anglican church or Episcopal church that had a Reverend Harry Croswell who had to fight the Congregationalists who had total control over Connecticut. So there is hundreds of years where nobody except the Congregationalists could have any elected position or even vote. And so the battle went on by the Episcopalians to be able to participate in the election. And there was a particular vote in 1830 where it's called the disestablishment of religion from the state took place. But it was really just between the Congregationalists and the Episcopalians, or the Anglo Church. But from that point on, Matilda's absolute, blaming the patriarchy for the whole situation was even now. I've been participating in something, and I'll stop in a second, but where at the church we decided to do what we were calling adult ed by a very quite brilliant scholar leading it. And it was called The Matrix of Race and Faith was the name of the series that we've just been having since September. And I ended up getting involved, and I took the liberty of, I was asked to present something. I took the liberty to present basically on Matilda, but also to change the title of the series to The Matrix of Race and Faith and Gender.
And that's the sort of way that so many of you, I'm looking around at names and faces, and so many of you are a piece of bringing Matilda back into the story and back into the way she's been written out. And I think one of the things we saw tonight was that it is not just adding one more voice. It's changing the whole narrative. It's changing the nature of the story. And I think Tracy and Melissa have done an extraordinary job of that. I want to invite you all tomorrow, if you're available, to come first to the Fayetteville Free Library at 2 o'clock to hear Tracy and Melissa talk more about the book and the story map. And then at 4 o'clock for cake and a great surprise, in addition to getting Tracy's book signed and talking to Melissa and seeing the story map as it's unveiled in the Gage Center. But we also have a gift from Marianne Krupsack, the first woman lieutenant governor in the country. that has to do with the trial of Susan B. Anthony. It's an artifact that is interactive, and I'm not going to tell you what it is. You have to come to the center, and then afterwards, we will be letting people know about it with pictures. So check our website, or if you're not on our mailing list, let me know and let us know, and we'll get you on, and then you can see some more. Well, also, we recorded this session, and so we will be having it available that you can share or watch again, or people who weren't able to see it. Tracy, any last words?
Thank you all again so much for being here, and I hope that we've piqued your interest, and there are more fun and exciting little reveals in the book. So please support the Gage Center, and I hope you'll buy it, and I hope, more importantly, that you enjoy it and learn something from it. Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Melissa, for putting bringing Matilda's travels to life. That's a big piece of
Thank
it.
you, Tracy. Melissa, any last words?
Just if you, hi Dad, just kidding. If you want any of those links, please, well, first of all, please share the story map far and wide. And if you need any of those links that I shared today, please get in touch with Sally, and we'll make sure that you have all the information you need.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming, and we'll see you on another Zoom or at the Gage Center. Good night.